Watch this. No way!
Hello and welcome back to the Cookie Jar Golf Podcast. I am Tom Mills and today I'm joined by Bruce Fitzpatrick.
Hello.
And golf historian David Normoyle. David, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Tom. Hello, Bruce. Nice to see you both.
Yeah, nice to see you. Well, how are you keeping out there?
Yeah, doing just fine. It's a little chilly in late February in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, but that's what winter's all about. It's just fine.
So what brings you to Latrobe, Pennsylvania then, David?
Well, funny you should ask, Tom. So I'm here doing some work for Arnold Palmer's family, Arnold Palmer being one of Latrobe's reasonably famous residents. I would also put up there, along with Mr. Palmer, Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. For a certain generation of people watching television, they would think of Fred Rogers. I'm not sure if your audience in the UK would, but certainly in the US, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is a huge part of what many people's childhood was all about. And he was just as much a famous son of Latrobe, Pennsylvania as Arnold Palmer. But anyway, I'm not here for Fred Rogers. I'm here for Arnold Palmer.
So tell us a little bit about you, David. You're a golf historian. What first got you into being interested in the history of golf, and what got you interested in Arnold Palmer?
Well, perhaps ironically, it's one and the same. So when I was as an undergrad university, I was a history major, and going into my final year, I wanted to do a senior honors thesis. And I had no idea exactly what I wanted it to be about, but I'm sure it was some incredibly boring topic. And just before the semester started, in August, I was playing golf with the supervisor of my thesis at Waterville Country Club in Waterville, Maine. And we were standing on the 15th tee, and he said to me, Arnold Palmer just published his autobiography. This was in 1999 with Jim Dodson. And he said, you might want to go check that out because that might be something interesting worth writing your thesis about. And so I did. And so it ended up being a paper about the cultural significance of Arnold Palmer, which led me to a job with the United States Golf Association straight out of university. And everything from there, for me as a golf historian, was as a result of that one moment and that decision to do that in my final year of university. Because I didn't even know you could be such a thing as a golf historian until I went to the USGA. And then when I saw my former colleague and mentor at the USGA, when I saw his office with 25,000 golf books in it, and I thought, well, this is the coolest office I've ever been in, and I want to do this. That's kind of the path that I went down.
So what does that involve then, the thesis around Palmer's biography? What research do you need to do beyond the book that goes into a thesis like that?
Well, the whole idea at that point in time was to try and understand a reasonably public life through more of an academic construct. So there were two particular historians who I looked to who had written about two things. One was the nature of the hero in American culture. So trying to apply the various models and methods that held consistently no matter what kind of hero we were talking about, whether it was in politics or public life or anything else. There's certain conditions that an American hero tended to have, and that lined up in large part with what Arnold Palmer was all about. But to me, the more interesting part of all of that was this idea that in the United States in the 19th century, before television, radio, mass communication, it was very much a culture of character in the sense that your success as an individual was determined by your work ethic, your honesty, your frugality, lots of qualities having more to do with how you conducted your affairs than how you were perceived. And then as we moved into the 20th century with the advent of all of those mass communication devices that I just mentioned, to your charisma, your charm, your looks, your attractiveness, all of those things became much greater example of your success. And I think we have only the Kardashians to look to prove that is exactly true.
Yeah.
But the point is that in America, at least, and that was the focus, not more broadly, that you have these two conflicting cultures, one of character and one of personality. And generally, somebody gets ahead in the world because of one or the other. But the striking thing about Arnold Palmer, I came to find and explored in the paper and the thesis, was he's really one of those rare people who's got both. And he's got both in harmony and in balance with one another. So it is both the personality and the charisma, but also the character and the traditional values that made him a kind of trusted person in the American public sphere from the 1950s through to the end of his life. And that was really something that struck me as remarkable because, for example, in the turbulent period of the 1960s, when you could look at so many accomplished athletes, from Jim Brown in American football to Muhammad Ali in boxing to Arthur Ashe in tennis, and then many others as well, they all could have been contenders for the great athlete of the decade in the 1960s, and yet it was a golfer from a little town in middle America, Latrobe, Pennsylvania, who was named the Associated Press Athlete of the Decade for the 1960s. And so the question is, why?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because he, from my understanding, he fought very hard to show golf as being a sport and not just a game. And the fact that he was voted that was quite remarkable. The whole point of this podcast really is we really want to highlight the legacy of Arnold Palmer and try and put a new spin on everything that he achieved in the game. And Arnold Palmer is certainly someone that's completely transcended the sport. And perhaps for a newer generation, it's not 100% understood how and why he had the impact he had. But I think for Arnold Palmer, from the bits that I've read, that it kind of all has its roots in family values and the way that he was brought up and raised by his father. He had a bit of an interesting start to his life with his father being a greenkeeper. Could you sort of tell us a little bit more about his upbringing and how he got into golf and all that bit of it?
Well, it's interesting because in the room that I'm sitting, which is currently in his house, because it has the best Wi-Fi connection here in Latrobe, and that's why I wanted to use it to connect with you all. We're about 300 yards away from the very house that he was born in, which was a greenkeeper's house right on what's now the 5th tee at Latrobe Country Club. And Arnold's father, Deacon, when he was a teenager, rather than work in the steel mill or one of the other options for a job for somebody at the time, he joined the crew, a very small crew that was ditch digging, just like in Caddyshack fashion. The world needs ditch diggers too. And he helped build the original 9 holes of Latrobe Country Club, which opened in 1921, so 100 years ago. And in 1929, after Deacon had become the greenkeeper, the full superintendent, just a few years before, in 1926, Arnold came along as the first child. And so he was born literally on a golf course, right there, right next to the golf course. And so, as his sister later remarked, she said, "It came as a great surprise to me when I learned that everybody didn't grow up on a golf course. We thought that's just the way that the world was. Everything about our life was eating, breathing, drinking, sleeping, and thinking about golf." And so Arnold, his father was the greenkeeper and the superintendent starting in 1926. And when he was really only 3 years old, 4 years old, his father became the professional as well. So he was the caretaker in all respects of Latrobe Country Club. But interestingly, despite that position, and I think what you all have done with Cookie Jar in telling the stories of golf clubs is that in part, whether it's explicit or implicit, you're elevating the role of the greenkeeper and the superintendent and the architect and the professional and all the people behind the scenes who make the game the game that it is. But that wasn't the case 80, 90, 100 years ago. Deacon Palmer wasn't allowed to go in the clubhouse like a member, and he wasn't allowed to, in the earliest of days. And he wasn't treated like a respected employee. And so Arnold saw that in his father. And I think in the way that he carried himself and in the dignity he sought to express, it was about trying to right the wrong done to his father and how he was treated by members and other people in the golf community at a time when it was not as welcoming, it was not as accessible, and there was definitely an upstairs, downstairs element, especially in private golf clubs.
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually when you kind of draw that contrast, I guess, between what Arnold saw happening to his father as a young boy at his home club, essentially, or I guess you couldn't even call it his home club because he's probably only allowed to play in very limited circumstances. And then the warmth and the generosity that he is now known for, you know, through multiple generations, really. I mean, to what extent do you think him winning the US Amateur in 1954, that almost announcing him in the world of golf, was that quite maybe a shift in the way people saw golfers and maybe that someone coming from a modest background breaking into the game and succeeding at the highest level? Was that quite a huge, quite a significant moment?
I think it's part of it. Just to tidy up a bit on the Deacon story, Arnold said many times that he simply wanted to treat others the way they wanted to be treated. And that's the thing, that golden rule that his father went on and on and on about, even though he was a man with a sort of religious nickname of Deacon. He was not necessarily the church-going type, but yet he was respected around the community as a man who lived in a very straightforward way. And part of that, I think, comes from the fact that he had childhood polio, which left his foot deformed and caused him to wear leg braces for his entire life. And so as a result of that perceived or real disability, Deacon transformed himself into a very physically fit person. Arnold would tell stories about how his father could do one-arm chin-ups with either arm 10 times.
Wow.
That's
Can't we
serious.
all? Everyone can do that, can't they?
And that he was a man who chose to speak through his actions and his work ethic. And I think that's one of those things that if you build up that that physical strength and that unyielding work ethic, it compensates in some ways for any disability that you might think you have, perceived or real, by yourself or others. And so that kind of treating people the way they wanted to be treated, and I think Arnold wanting to get approval from his very challenging father, was a really big thing in 1954 when he had gone through some ups and downs and highs and lows in his amateur career. He lost his best friend in a car accident when he was in college, dropped out of school with just a few credits to go at Wake Forest, and really he was a paint salesman. And what I think is interesting, served in the Coast Guard for a couple of years and was kind of unmoored in a lot of ways. And so winning that amateur in 1954 gave him a kind of clarity and direction going forward. He called it the turning point in his life because it proved that he could play at the highest level. And I think, Bruce, you made an allusion to how he was perceived. And if you look at the newspaper accounts from the day, it was always son of a golf pro Arnold Palmer against millionaire playboy Bobby Sweeney in the final. Bobby Sweeney, interestingly, a fellow member of the Oxford and Cambridge Golfing Society.
All right.
Oxonian, sadly, but that's all right. Nobody's perfect. In any event, but that was a big part of it, was this sort of blue-collar guy, son of a golf professional. And by the way, it was a 9-hole golf course until the 1960s, a point worth spending a little bit of time on. But yeah, no, that was a big part of his ethos. And then by vaulting onto the scene as a very good money winner, but then really ultimately a superstar in the late 50s and early 60s, he always lifted up his father as an example of what he learned from. And even, I don't know if you saw it a few weeks ago, the famous American interviewer Larry King passed away. And there was an interview he did with Arnold from, I can't remember if it was the 1990s or not, but anyway, in this 20-odd minute interview, Arnold mentions his father 3 times in significant ways at length. And so he was always there, part of him, a huge part of who he was and what his identity came to be.
It's a strange one because his father seemed to be somebody that didn't give out praise very easily, I suppose. He wrote in his book when he came back from Birkdale winning the Open for the first time that it was not long before his father said, "Well, that's good, but put down the claret jug and help me cut the back 9." And it's so interesting that it's a style of parenting that you don't hear much of now. It's a lot of praise them and do well, but it certainly seemed to do Palmer and sort of set him down the path of working very, very hard to impress him.
That's exactly right. And when you come to Latrobe, which I hope you both do, because there's something about it that's really, it's magical. It's like going to the football pitch where Pele learned to play the game. Except imagine Pele never left that pitch. He lived across the street from that pitch for his entire life, came to conquer the game, won all those World Cups, and went back to it and never left. That's what Latrobe is like, this little small town. And I think part of that's important because if he were not here, he would cease being Deacon Palmer's son, who could maybe get a little too big for his britches. But here, that could never happen. He would never be allowed to do that. He would always be kept, not in his place, because I think that has overly negative connotations, but kept in an environment where he was the son of the greenkeeper and superintendent and professional. And so don't ever forget that. And don't ever think that you're bigger than the world, or frankly, that you invented golf, as though a lot of people might think that our successful athletes today do. It's like they invented their very sports. So he kind of actually did invent the modern professional athlete, but that's a separate part of the story.
And I guess there's maybe a tendency amongst younger generations who maybe haven't seen him play or have only really watched golf in the era of Tiger Woods to probably conflate Palmer's career with that of Nicklaus and Player and see them as the big three and talk about Palmer's 62 tour wins and his 7 majors. But even sort of from an early phase in his career from 1960, really, I guess you could say, when he meets Mark McCormack, he has much bigger visions, I guess, for the game of golf and for his life as well as a businessman too. Could you perhaps, speak a little bit about that aspect of his life?
And I do think that's a really part of the sort of remarkable American life, without being too cliche about these things. And I'm not saying American dream, I'm just saying American life intentionally, because part of this American life story is that Arnold Palmer was the son of a greenkeeper who wasn't allowed to play on the golf course or swim in the pool because he was the child of an employee. And yet in 1971, he bought Latrobe Country Club. And on top of that, Tom, I was going to say that in light of the sort of McCormack and IMG story is that, lots of people might want to have children who grew up to be successful athletes or successful business people. But what Arnold Palmer did was he transformed what it means to be a professional athlete. Through his innovation, he changed what an athlete is, and he changed what the business of sport is all about. And those are stories, at least in the 20th century, that really only happen primarily in this country on the scale that they did, for lots of other reasons. But the connection between Arnold Palmer and Mark McCormack was a huge part of that. So much so that today, any athlete who ever gets on a private jet, whether they fly it like Arnold did, or it's flown by somebody else, or they sign an endorsement deal, they have, in a lot of respects, Arnold Palmer and Mark McCormack to thank for that, because they created a new kind of model in the 1960s for what the professional athlete was all about in the modern age. So
that, I'll probably get this wrong because I'm just, I don't know these things.
You've read one book and you think you're an expert, don't you, Tom?
Initially, Mark McCormack and Arnold Palmer worked together as just the two of them, didn't they? It took a bit of time before they expanded out. How did that whole thing with IMG come about? Because that was revolutionary, and like the agent didn't really exist at that point. So how did that come about, and how did it change the sport?
Well, there's an interesting take on it. In 1967, McCormack's own book, Arnie, The Making of the Legend, addresses this specifically, which is another book to add to your reading list, Tom. Very good.
More than one would be useful.
But I think what's interesting about the dynamic of this particular relationship, and it's one of these things where the legend gets so big around it that sometimes it's hard to parse out all the details, and I'm far from expert in this, I'll admit off the top. But I think what's interesting about it is how McCormack was just a golf nut. He played in the U.S. Open. I mean, he was a really good amateur golfer and played extremely well, but he was never at the professional level. And yet, as a young lawyer living in Cleveland, he saw that there was an opportunity. And so he started out this sort of national sports management group, and it had a number of different golfers, and he was arranging things for them. And Arnold was one of a number of guys who had yet to break through. I mean, Art Wall had won the Masters, and in 1959, and other players could have had the same claim to fame, Jimmy Barrett or whatever. And Arnold was the one who said, no, I don't want to be part of this group. I want to be just the two of us. That really came from Arnold. So that's where they split out. And it was just the two of them. And then from there, International Management Group, the IMG entity, grew and then brought in Nicholas and Player and others to the stable. But Arnold Palmer was always the very first client. And it was intended that they would just be the two of them. But then as the business opportunities grew, there seemed to be an understanding that it made sense to follow that growth.
And how was this so revolutionary? How was it different to what had happened before?
I think the revolutionary part of it was the scale and the scope. It was the idea of associating somebody's name, not just as an endorser, but as part of the owner of the business as well. So there was a huge amount of additional revenue that was coming in. And I think one of the key elements in the Palmer approach is that for years and years, and it still exists to this day, there was the concept of the victory ad. So Daniel Berger wins at Pebble Beach this past weekend. And on Monday, when all the magazines come out, all of his sponsors run ads saying, congratulations on your victory at Pebble Beach, Daniel Berger. Thanks for using our product, whatever. So they associate their product with that flash moment of victory. And that's great for that flash moment. But what happens when you stop winning tournaments? You stop having opportunities for the victory ads. And so the shift, and I think the thing that really distinguishes Palmer from all of his contemporaries and really set a new kind of model, is that his brand, as envisioned by Mark McCormick and IMG and others, was not one of being a winner of tournaments, but as being a success in life. And so if you wanted to succeed, you would associate yourself with the products that he endorsed and supported. Not because he won the tournament or because he lost the tournament, because he had all of the attributes of success that one seeks in a good life. Now, some of that's marketing makeup and jargon and all that. And I think you have to acknowledge that. But that, to me, was one of the fundamental shifts in approach as it applied to Arnold Palmer's story.
And I guess maybe one of those traits there that makes him such a, I don't want to say appealing, maybe that's the wrong way of describing it, but yeah, appealing to people like Mark McCormack and the kind of nascent sports marketing industry is that he's a good looking young man who plays the game with such kind of passion and goes for broke on every single shot. And at the same time manages to kind of gather this army of loyal followers who he's equally at ease with compared to, say, President Eisenhower. It's just this remarkable way he has with people that makes him such an attractive prospect, I guess, to potential sponsors too.
I think that's part of it. And that goes back to the Latrobe story, that if he left an understanding of being Deacon Palmer's son and went out and became a big shot and started big timing people, then that genuineness goes away. And to the point about the sort of success. Well, here's a statistic that I recall from 21 years ago now when I was writing my senior thesis, that it took from 1960 through all of the 60s, all of the 70s, all of the 1980s, it took until 1991, when Michael Jordan had been in the league for 7 years, to pass Arnold Palmer as the single highest paid endorsement athlete in the world.
Wow.
So from 1960 to 1991, one guy, a golfer, was the highest paid endorsement athlete in the world. That's what changed the calculus.
And that gets lost actually in the modern day when people see Tiger Woods as just being the sort of sea change. And there's people like Claude Harmon who's, tells young pros now to go up and shake Tiger Woods' hand and thank him for the career that a professional golfer at the highest level gets to enjoy today. But in many ways, that's really forgetting Palmer. Actually, he is arguably as significant, if not more significant, in that story of the kind of rise of the professional golfer, really.
Yeah, so let's just take a look at the key governing bodies in the game. USGA, the RNA, PGA Tour, PGA of America, and Augusta National. They're the ones that all have seats at the table that make decisions about where the future of the game's going. As a competitor, who was the first person to win the U.S. Amateur, the U.S. Open, and the U.S. Senior Open? That's sustained success over a long period of time. The answer? Arnold Palmer. When we think about the Open Championship, who was the person who, when he came to play in the Centenary Open at St. Andrews in 1960, and then won the next year, finished second by a shot to Kilnagel, wins the next year at Birkdale, and then has to qualify as the defending champion at Troon the next year, thereby rewriting the exemption and entry rules, and convinces all the American professionals of the day to come over, in a lot of respects revives, I won't call it saves, but revives the Open Championship, Arnold Palmer, who's the first person to win 4 Masters titles. Arnold Palmer, and to do so in the age of television, who, with Jack Nicklaus and others, started the PGA Tour in 1968 as a break-off from the PGA of America. Arnold Palmer.
Yeah.
You got it. So
I know the answer.
You can't tell the story of any of these without telling the story of this legacy. And he didn't just do it because he was a winner, and he didn't just do it because he lost with grace. He did it because there was something else. There was a kind of intangible that drew people to him. And that's really this legacy that we're talking all about. And that's what we think still matters today, tomorrow, for 50 and 100 years, as long as we play golf.
I controversially on this podcast about a year ago, ill thought of at the time.
You're still wet behind the ears, as they say.
Yeah, I was a bit naive, a bit new to it all. And I said that Arnold Palmer was instrumental in the, let's call it the evolution of the Grand Slam. Could you put me right or wrong on this podcast right now? Was he involved in sort of evolving the Grand Slam from the amateur day to the professional day?
No, he was there. And it was a large part because of a conversation he had with Bob Drum, who was the local writer here in Pittsburgh, and also at the encouragement of his father, who wanted him to go play in that Centenary Open at St. Andrews in 1960, that there was a kind of shift away from the Bobby Jones method of defining the Grand Slam to the modern professional method. Herbert Warren Wynn, American golf writer, said it wasn't really until the sort of early 50s, say 52 to 54, that the Masters started to be considered in that realm of real major titles. So if you think about it, I mean, what were we doing 6 years ago? It's 2015. That seems like yesterday. But from 1960, when Arnold Palmer almost wins the Grand Slam, right? He wins the Masters, he wins the U.S. Open, he finishes second in the Open, and I think it was top 5, top 10 of the PGA. I can't remember right now, but in any event, it was very close. It was one of those great years. That was only a couple of years removed from the Masters never having been on television, never having been anything. And so absolutely, Arnold Palmer is not only involved with, but arguably central to the notion of what the modern professional Grand Slam is all about.
I got ridiculed on this podcast. Ridiculed, I did. But
It wasn't by me. It must have been by Sam or someone else.
Going back and looking at his, because we've touched upon a few things, but it'd be interesting to touch upon his actual career in golf. And he really did sort of set the world alight, really, didn't he? For a long time, and then this sort of arrival of Jack Nicklaus really did sort of upset things and change the boat. Now, they've since said that they're very good friends, but how strong was that rivalry there in around that time?
Well, I think the rivalry was extremely strong, and it was really important for golf. It's good for any sport to have a series of rivals who are going against one another. I mean, you think about the clashes between Barcelona and Madrid in so many of the sort of Derby Cups or Derby Cups matches. Rivalries are essential to what any sport's all about. But one of the things that I think gets overlooked is that there's 10 years of difference between Jack and Arnold. Mm-hmm. And it all comes down to this key moment, which is why Arnold lit the world on fire in some ways in sports. When he did, was it really comes to 1960 at Cherry Hills Country Club in Denver, Colorado. And as we saw in this year's Super Bowl, where we had the greatest of all time, Tom Brady, playing against the greatest of right now, Patrick Mahomes, you had one of these rare instances in sport where in golf, the past, meaning Ben Hogan, the great U.S. Open champion who won 4 titles from 1940 to 1960. He never finished outside the top 10 in the U.S. Open, arguably had a 5th with the Hail America Open. I mean, he was the quintessential U.S. Open championship player for America in the 1940s and 50s. You had him competing for and contending for the victory, his 5th U.S. Open that afternoon at Cherry Hills. You had Jack Nicklaus, who was still an amateur, who had won the U.S. Amateur the year before at the Broadmoor in 1959 and would win the U.S. Amateur again in 1961 with a share for the lead on the back nine. And then you had the player of the moment who had won the Masters earlier that year and would end up being the Sports Illustrated Sportsman of the Year, the AP Athlete of the Decade, won the Hickok belt in Arnold Palmer. It all came together on this one afternoon. And that's just not something that happens very often.
Mm.
And he was the one who didn't just win, but he was 7 strokes behind going into the final round.
Yeah, the birth of the charge.
Yeah, remarkable, isn't it?
He drove the first green, 346 yards at Cherry Hills, made birdie, birdied 6 of the first 7 holes going out, shot 65 to win. Amazing.
It's absolutely amazing. I know I'm constantly jumping about a bit here, but you did just mention Ben Hogan. He did have a fairly fractious relationship with Hogan, didn't he? What was behind all that?
Well, Tom, what if I never called you anything other than fella?
Yeah, it's quite condescending, I suppose.
So I think it was just, look, I wasn't there and I don't understand what was going on, but I think respect goes both ways. And it seems like they just didn't have mutual respect for one another, maybe as professionals, but, not everybody you work with has to be your chum either. So it's a shame. It would have been nice to think that the greats can, as Jack and Arnold did throughout the rest of their life, have a kind of mutual enjoyment for one another outside the competitive sphere. But that just never seemed to happen with Hogan and Arnold.
Maybe I'm getting, again, I might be putting myself up for a moment of humiliation that's akin to Tom's last year when he talked about the Grand Slam. But we could always edit out the podcast in this case. Am I right in thinking that Palmer kind of calmed down a sort of overly ruckus gallery at the Masters when they were taking jabs at Jack Nicklaus about his weight and that kind of thing? And is that a story that's been repeated when Nicklaus was about to win his first Masters? I think maybe that's incorrect.
I'm listening.
But I think the story goes that Nicklaus was getting some abuse from spectators at Augusta about his weight, and it was like, fat lad Jack's going to, win the Masters, and Arnold was kind of the established favorite at that point, and I think Palmer kind of tried to calm Nicklaus down and just say, look, like, don't worry about them, but also tried to calm the crowd down and urge them to be more respectful towards Jack. But I may have misheard that from
I don't think so. And I don't think that's the only time or the only story. I mean, you think about 1962, the U.S. Open at Oakmont. Here we were in Arnold's backyard. He was supposed to win. He finished tied with Nicklaus, the low 72 holes, after really being favored in so many ways. And again, Nicklaus, this was his first professional tournament win. He beats Arnold in a playoff, and Jack didn't 3-putt, and Arnold 3-putted 11 or 12 times. I can't remember the exact number, but the point is, it was hugely disappointing. And I think that was in a lot of ways the beginning, post Cherry Hills, of this sort of public enmity between the two, because Arnold was beloved and Jack was taking away what he should have been winning in the eyes of the public. And that's where I think, let's go back to Deacon Palmer's son. Remember, I think one of the key differences between Jack and Arnold is to remember that Jack grew up as the son of a member at Scioto, and Arnold grew up as the son of the greenkeeper. And there's just a difference in the two.
Yeah.
But I think part of what that's all about, this is in no way diminishing Jack, but I think just a reflection on who Arnold was as Deacon Palmer's son, is that there's just certain ways you treat people, and that the game deserves our dignity above any sort of partisan passions of the moment. And so if Arnold did speak up for Jack, I think it was out of respect to Jack, but even more so out of respect to the game that his father taught him in the first place.
What do you think it was? Why do you think it was that Arnold generally was loved by everybody in the game, and the galleries absolutely adored him and what he stood for? there certainly wasn't the same, or appeared from someone from a different generation, but there certainly didn't appear the same love for Jack. And there was also sort of a little bit of animosity towards Jack because he was beating Palmer. Why do you think there wasn't the same connection there?
Well, I think without reflecting in any way on Jack, but just simply focusing on Arnold, you reap what you sow, in the sense that he planted seeds everywhere he went. He looked people in the eye. He winked at them. He engaged with them. He was just as interested in finding out about who they were and signing autographs. And he was just not shut off. He was completely open and I think in all the extroverted ways that we think about, fed off the energy of the crowds. It would be interesting in the context of COVID to see how a player like Arnold Palmer would have done in this new environment without fans. I think he would have done very poorly, because in so many ways, he was, going back to the beginning, he was a show off. I mean, when he was a little kid, son of the greenkeeper, he would say, here, let me show you how I can hit this shot. And when Babe Zaharias came and did an exhibition at Latrobe, wanted to be able to show off in all those contexts. And I think the great athletes really do have a little bit of performance show off in them. And that's not bad, because they are performers. I mean, that's the essence. That's the deal that you make when you become a professional athlete. I think sometimes current professionals and even former professionals forgot that that's the deal that you made. That if what you were really about is the purity of the game, you should remain an amateur. The moment you become a professional, you're no longer just a player. You are now an entertainer. And some people get that and some people don't. And I think Arnold, for whatever reason, whether it was an intentional thing or it's just part of his very nature, he understood that you were there to engage with people. They paid a price of admission and they should get value for their ticket.
I just wanted to return to something you mentioned earlier, albeit briefly, David, which was Arnold Palmer, the pilot. Just because I think he's quite interesting, you know, despite talking about him as an entertainer and someone who, you know, perhaps found a real thrill in you know, playing golf on a public stage and kind of fulfilling that role as a performer and entertaining people. Yeah, I've still very much got the kind of Arnold Palmer, Deacon Palmer's values kind of ringing in my ears from what you talked about at the beginning of the podcast, and how something like Palmer's fear, Arnold, this is his fear of flying. Actually, that was something that kind of motivated him to try and overcome that, and in the end become competent at that, or more than competent at that, and become a pilot for, well, decades, really. Could you perhaps just sort of speak about that and how you know, this interesting value, I guess, that he has of always wanting to kind of improve himself as a person and not just maybe the public image that people see?
Very much so. I don't think I could really add anything to what you just said, but in 1955, when he wins the U.S. Amateur in 1954, turns professional, gets married to Winnie, they elope, which is an amazing story in of itself. And he goes out on tour in 1954, and they got an old car and they borrowed some money from their parents, $500 or so. And they got this 19-foot long trailer. It was not a beautiful Airstream like everybody's going gaga for over COVID. And, you know, you can hardly buy one of these classic trailers anymore because everybody wants to have them to go explore the out of doors. But anyway, they had this sort of secondhand beat up, and as they said, it looked like a loaf of bread, 19 feet long, looked like a loaf of bread. And this is what they lived in as they went out on tour. And they hated it. They just absolutely hated it. And so Arnold resolved that there's got to be a way to do this better. And so starting in 1956, he began to take flying lessons, in part because he wanted to overcome that fear of flying, and also because that lifestyle was not pleasant or appealing, especially as you were starting a family. And so as he became more competent, he found a kind of passion for flying that he had never expected. And he said in various instances that if golf was his vocation, that flying was his avocation. It was the thing that made him feel most alive. And so starting in the mid-1950s all the way to when he gave up flying in 2011, he was a devoted pilot. And not only for business purposes, though that's a big part of it, but also he set an around-the-world record in 1976 for a particular class of business jet. And when Cessna came out with the Citation 10, he was the first civilian in the world to get one. Now, he was a pretty humble guy
Wow.
in a lot of ways. And if you look at how he lived and where he lived, he didn't spend a lot of money on material things, but he was willing to spend some money on jets.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of that is because he came to realize, hand in hand with the development of his business as a professional athlete with Mark McCormick and IMG, that, you know, you can have $1 or you can have $1 billion, but you're only going to have 24 hours. And so if he could organize his life in such a way so that he could live where he wanted to live and do what he wanted to do and use the plane as a tool to do it, well, I mean, think about how efficient you could be.
Yeah.
We had a fun time last in December, just a couple of months ago. The Arnold Palmer Cup was at Bay Hill. It was supposed to be at Lahinch in Ireland this year, but it was rescheduled because of COVID, and they could get everybody in one place together. And as we were giving the players tours of the office and sharing with them stories about the legacy, one of the players said, you know, we were walking down the 16th hole and we had heard that his house was there, and we were wondering which one it was because we thought it was the biggest one. And I said, he lived in a little condo across the street. And his whole world, his use of his resources was about organizing his life in the most optimal way possible for him. He wanted his house simple, to be close to his office, simple, and close to an airport where he could travel and do the things that he needed to do.
And yet he remains such a devoted family man as well, by all accounts. I think I read somewhere, it's interesting to talk about the juxtaposition of flying and, you know, enjoying the sort of newest jet on offer, but also kind of taking, I think it was his oldest daughter, Peggy, to university on that jet, and then still, you know, carrying her suitcases himself up 3 flights of stairs to her dorm room. It's just, I thought that was such a neat insight into how, despite all of his success and his fame and his huge wealth, you know, he did the small things like that right, and made sure he was a devoted father and a devoted husband.
Yeah, I think you can sensationalize a lot of things about a public figure's life, but he did organize his life in such a way so that he could give the time that he wanted to the things that he cared about most. And that's a clear example of that.
You mentioned there, while we're on family, you mentioned there about the elopement of Arnold and Winnie. And you mentioned that it's quite an interesting story. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Winnie was from Eastern Pennsylvania and Arnold was from Western Pennsylvania. And that might not seem like a big difference, but it's a big difference for some. And I don't think that I don't think Winnie's parents were all too keen on who Arnold was, this paint salesman, amateur golfer who had done nothing. And he tells the story in one of his books about how he decided to turn pro, missed the cut, drove all through the night and showed up at her doorstep, unshaven and smelling, having made no money whatsoever, and basically said, "I want your daughter's hand in marriage." And the father said, "What on earth are you talking about? You're insane." So you haven't done anything in your life. Now, I mean, I'm probably not telling the story perfectly, but the point is they just, they were crazy about each other. And so they said, forget about it. We're going to go and we're going to elope. And they did.
Is it right that he proposed to Winnie after 3 days of knowing her?
It was, I can't remember the exact number, but it was a very, very brief period of time.
I mean, that's incredible, isn't it? You just don't hear stories like that anymore.
Well, but I think that what that is reflective of in some ways, and, you know, none of us are 100% of anything. But if there's one thing that I have learned in spending time with Amy, their daughter, and in reflecting on this legacy, is that a big part of what Arnold was all about was he was a person who was very instinctive, and he trusted his instincts, and he was not necessarily an overanalyzer or somebody who would belabor a point of trying to make sure that some sort of structured strategic plan was all perfectly laid out. And in a lot of ways, that was at odds with the approach that IMG took to managing his business career. He just wanted straightforward, simple communication with people, and he went by instinct. And that's a big part of who he was, that go for broke philosophy in some ways too.
He definitely seemed like somebody that when he knew what he wanted, he would just pursue that route. That's what he was doing. It's just, you've got to appreciate that, haven't you?
I think that's exactly right. Now, I'm sort of reflecting on something we were talking about a little bit earlier about how golfers perceive him today. And I think that we're at an interesting moment, because if we reflect on the brand of the Masters, for example, which has exalted status in golf and beyond, and we think about its patron saint, Bobby Jones, we sort of have this vision in our mind of a winner of the Grand Slam in 1930 and all these major championships and Calamity Jane and his amateur ethos and all of that. But if you were somebody who was first watching the Masters on television in the 1960s, your vision, your introduction to Bobby Jones would be somebody who was in a wheelchair, somebody who was essentially crippled in the conventional sense of that, and who died in 1971. And you would have never seen him play golf. You would have never seen him at his height and in his glory. And so for that particular time, Bobby Jones was an old and very disabled man. But then as time went on and his legacies get reshaped, the people who come to the Masters today think of him as this vibrant, vital man who you see in the videos about doing the How I Play Golf series from 1931 and smashing a ball through the camera with great Hollywood stars and having all of this style. And that's an interesting part of what legacies are all about, because we're, as you know, 2021 is an important year in the Palmer context, because it's 100 years since the Latrobe Country Club, which his father helped build, opened. It's 50 years since he took over as the owner of Latrobe Country Club in 1971. And this September will be the 5th anniversary of Mr. Palmer's passing in 2016. And so for a lot of people in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years, they think of him almost grandfatherly, right? This old white-haired guy who aged before our eyes. But if we look at the model and the method employed with Bobby Jones and the Masters, there's still a long, long way to go in thinking about this vital, thriving man who redefined what professional golf was all about and an important part in global history.
Yeah, perhaps you could give us an insight, if you wouldn't mind, into the work you're doing there with the Palmer legacy. Am I right in thinking he collected so many letters, or kept so many letters from fans? He was a avid collector of clubs as well. I imagine there's a huge amount in the way of artifacts and kind of Arnold Palmer memorabilia, if you like, to catalogue, and all of which has its place somewhere in this kind of rich tapestry of his life and his legacy that you're trying to preserve and make more people aware of.
All true, Bruce. And when we think about legacies, and I was just reflecting on something the other day about completely independent of golf, that not a day goes by in politics that somehow Winston Churchill's name is not evoked or quoted, right? And not a day goes by when people talk about architecture when Frank Lloyd Wright isn't somehow reflected on. The name is just so famous and so ubiquitous. And so it made me wonder, who are the caretakers of these legacies after these people died in the 1950s and 60s, in the instance of Churchill and Frank Lloyd Wright. And in the instance of Frank Lloyd Wright, there are 75 different entities, whether they're his personal foundation or other little preservation societies, that are involved with caring for his architectural legacy. And thousands of people still visit his buildings every day. And so in thinking about that, I wonder how we apply that same sort of methodology to the story of Arnold Palmer. Because if 50 years from now, or 100 years from now, that Arnold Palmer is not part of the daily conversation of golf, what replaces him? Who's there instead? And is that ultimately better for the game? This person who is so essential to the development of all of these institutions that we think about, the PGA Tour, Augusta National, the Masters, the Open Championship, the USGA, everything. Is that a better thing? And so that's the approach that we're taking, which is, what are the steps that we need to consider now so that not our generation, your generation, my generation, but the next generations, as you were thinking about it, know who he was, know why he mattered, and know what his role is today. Not just a founder and an influencer of these things, but as somebody whose very life and the stories from that life are still vital in how we go about celebrating the sport going forward.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I came to this sport relatively recently. I came about 7 years ago, so I've not been playing, the entirety of my life. And if you were to come to me and say, just who are the biggest movers and shakers in golf. Perhaps Arnold Palmer wouldn't have been someone that I would have mentioned. Moving that forward now, that you've got this debate going on about distance because people are driving the ball too far. And in one of your early stories at Cherry Hills, the first hole, he drives a 340 yard to the green on the first hole. And it's almost like that this era has a possibility to just be forgotten, even though he's done so much for the game. And even with this conversation with you now, it's stuff that I didn't even know. And he's done so much for the game. And it's so important to try and keep these legacies. And it's so difficult actually to put them, in order to make sure that Tiger would not have happened if not for Arnold Palmer. Arnold Palmer would not have happened if not for Bobby Jones. And that goes all the way down the line, doesn't it?
It sure does. So let me ask you a question, Tom. So the people listening to this podcast won't see this, but over your left-hand shoulder, there's a drawing of a particular famous cartoon character. Can you tell us who that is?
It's Mickey Mouse.
Okay. So you picked up the game of golf 7 years ago. How old were you when you first heard about Mickey Mouse?
2, 3.
Okay. How much money do you think Disney spends marketing Mickey Mouse to 30-year-olds?
Nothing?
0. Why? Because they spend a lot making sure that 2 and 3-year-olds know exactly who it is.
Mm.
And so this is the challenge here, which is how do we make sure that somebody so core and fundamental to the story of the game globally, even though it's this particular American life, is somebody who, when you become a golfer, you know this story. You don't wait until you've been a golfer for 15 or 20 years to learn this story.
Mm. And there's some great work that's already been done there. I mean, involving yourself, I noticed that the USGA museum has a kind of exhibit on that. There's a wonderful drawing actually by an artist, which is essentially, I think it's composed, I'm not sure what the technical term is, but it's composed of thousands of signatures that are kind of layered in such a way that it kind of creates one of Palmer's sort of famous poses, which is brilliant. How not only is it's a very sort of skilled art form, but it also speaks, I think, to how many signatures he would have given out to these people, and it ties together the Arnold Palmer's character and what a warm person he was with a very like sort of stunning visual of how to remember his legacy. And I guess it's work like that appeals to a younger generation that's instrumental in preserving all of these legacies, whether it's old Tom Morris or Bobby Jones, Palmer, Tiger Woods as well, in years to come.
Well, and you've nailed it, Bruce. It's about how do you take this story and present it to a current generation so that they can make it their own going forward. So the artist you referred to is named Jim Chase, and the painting, it's really a piece of art that he created, an illustration, is called Gratitude. And what it is, it's a very large portrait of Arnold Palmer in, as you said, a very familiar pose. And what it's made up of is even more amazing than autographs, is it's made up of individual quotes given by Arnold throughout the course of his life. And in pencil, with minute detail, Jim Chase, over years, created this singularly amazing work of art. Now imagine devoting years of your life developing special breathing techniques so that you would learn exactly when your pulse was firing, and you would learn to make pencil strokes when your pulse was not going so that you wouldn't shake your hand. This is this artist, and this is what he created, and it's on display at the USGA Museum, which not only has an exhibit for Arnold, but it's actually named after him. It's the Arnold Palmer Center for Golf History. And it's a perfect expression of how this American story, this American life, all of the good things that ever happened in that life were because of two genuine loves, a love for golf and a love for people. And I think when we talked earlier about why did people connect with him, it's because he loved them first. He loved the galleries. He loved connecting with people. He loved putting on a show. And so that's how you get the inspiration of a guy like Jim Chase as an artist who devotes years of his life to create this singularly unique piece of art on display at the USGA's museum. We're
always very respectful of our guest time, David. But as a parting gift, Arnie's Army, where did that come about?
Well, it came about in the late 1950s. 1959 is generally the year that it's given credit. And at Fort Gordon, outside of Augusta, Georgia, there were soldiers stationed, and they helped to. Actually, that's a mistake here. They were invited to be guests of the tournament, or even at that time, it wasn't as difficult to get passes as it is today. And so there was this group of soldiers from Fort Gordon who were following Arnie around. And one of the local sports writers named them Arnie's Army. And it just stuck and grew and grew and grew.
Yeah. Well,
Incredible.
if any of our listeners are interested in doing any further learning and reading, where would you point them if they were looking to learn more about Arnold?
Well, the first place to go is to the Palmer Foundation. So palmerfoundation.org. It's the Arnold and Winnie Palmer Foundation. It's the important ongoing tribute to the legacy of the founders by Arnold and Winnie's daughter, Amy. And it's about celebrating the things for young people, again, with that very forward focus that Arnold and Winnie cared about in their lives. Having wonderful natural places for people to enjoy, to instill character and development, and also to have healthy kids in line with the hospital that they supported in Orlando and so many other different things. So that's a great place to start. Definitely watch the Arnold Palmer Invitational presented by MasterCard in early March, which is sort of the window to the world of the legacy story. And there are so many great books to reflect on, but I think A Life Well Played, which you just recently read, Tom, is one of them. That was released in 2016. There was a fun book of memorabilia released by Arnold in 2004, and then A Golfer's Life, his autobiography with Jim Dotson, which is the start of it all. For me in 1999 is always a great place to go.
Fantastic. David, thank you so much for being so generous in your time and teaching us a bit more about this fantastic totemic figure in golf history, and for pointing out some more resources that we can use there just to preserve the legacy of the great man.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you both for having me.
Watch this.